My name is Ezekiel Thornbury, though most folks who knew me on the circuit just called me Zeke. I'm 80 years old now, sitting here in 1928, and my hands shake when I try to write. So I'm speaking this into one of those recording machines my grandson brought from Austin. He says people need to hear these old stories before we're all gone. I suppose he's right. I was born in 1848, up in eastern Tennessee, Rhea County, on a tobacco farm that my daddy worked but didn't own. We were never what you'd call prosperous, but we had enough. 3 rooms, a stone fireplace, my mother's vegetable garden that she tended like it was sacred ground. I had 2 older brothers, William and Thomas, and a sister, Mary Catherine, who was just 7 when the war came. I don't remember much about those early years, except the feeling of being hungry most of the time, and my mother singing hymns while she worked. Her voice was the prettiest thing on that farm. The war destroyed us, like it destroyed most folks who didn't have much to begin with. Both my brothers went off in '62, William with the Confederacy, because that's just what you did if you were a young man in Tennessee, even if you didn't own slaves or have any particular stake in the cause. Thomas followed 6 months later. Neither one came home. We got word about William in '63, killed at Chickamauga. Thomas just disappeared somewhere in Virginia, and we never knew what became of him. My daddy, aged 20 years in those 4 years of war, started drinking corn whiskey when he could get it, stopped talking much except to curse. The Reconstruction was harder than the war, at least for us. The farm went under in '67 when my daddy couldn't pay what was owed. I was 19 years old, watching everything we had get sold off to pay debts to men in suits who'd come down from the north. My mother died that winter, and I believe it was just from being worn out, from carrying too much sorrow in her body for too long. I remember her last words to me were about making sure Mary Catherine had enough firewood. Even dying, she was thinking about keeping someone else warm. I caught typhoid fever in the spring of '68. Laid up in a borrowed bed in a church basement in Dayton for almost 3 weeks, burning up, seeing things that weren't there, convinced I was going to die at 20 years old without ever having done a single thing that mattered. There was a Methodist circuit rider who came through, Reverend somebody, I don't recall his name now, and he sat with me one night when the fever was worst. Didn't preach at me, didn't pray loud or make a show of it. Just sat there reading scripture in a quiet voice, and something about that steadiness, that calm presence in the middle of my terror, it broke something open in me. When the fever finally passed and I could stand again, I was different. I can't explain it better than that. I looked at my life. What was left of it? No family except Mary Catherine, who'd gone to live with an aunt in Knoxville. No farm, no prospects. Nothing, and I felt this pull, this certainty that I was meant to do what that circuit rider had done. Meant to go to people who were alone and scared and sit with them. Read to them. Remind them they weren't forgotten. So in 1872, at 24 years old, I took what little I had a Bible my mother had given me, $7 silver, and a chestnut gelding I'd worked a whole season to buy, a horse I named Ezra after the prophet, and I headed west to Texas. Texas in 1872 wasn't what I'd imagined from the stories people told back in Tennessee. I'd heard about wide open spaces and opportunity, but what I found when I crossed into the hill country was something harder, something lonelier. The land was beautiful in a stark way, all limestone bluffs and cedar breaks and sky that went on forever. But the people were scattered thin, living in dugouts and log cabins miles apart from each other, suspicious of strangers, worn down by drought and Comanche raids that had only stopped a few years before. I rode into Lampasas in late summer, and the main street was just dust and a few wooden buildings that looked like they might blow away in a strong wind. I thought I'd start preaching right away, that people would welcome a man of God, that I had something important to offer. I was young and full of conviction and stupid. First place I tried was a saloon in Lampasas. Walked right in during the afternoon when it was quiet and started talking about salvation and redemption to maybe 6 men who were drinking away their wages. They laughed at me. One of them, a buffalo hunter with a beard down to his chest, told me if I didn't leave, he'd shoot my horse. I left. Tried the town square in Burnett a week later, stood on a crate, and started preaching to whoever would listen. And exactly 3 people stopped, 2 of them just to mock me, and one old woman who gave me a biscuit out of pity before walking away. I realized pretty quick that I had no idea what I was doing. That's when I met Silas Drummond. I was camped by the Colorado River, maybe 10 miles north of Lampasas, hungry and discouraged and seriously considering going back to Tennessee, when this older man rode up on a mule. He was probably 60 years old then. Weathered face, white hair, wore a black coat that had been mended so many times it was more thread than fabric. He introduced himself as a Methodist circuit rider, said he'd been riding through central Texas for almost 20 years. We talked all night by that campfire, and he told me things nobody had bothered to teach me. He said people on the frontier didn't want a stranger telling them they were sinners. They already knew their own failings better than any preacher could. What they needed was someone who'd stay long enough to know their names, to baptize their babies, to sit with their dying, to come back again and again until they trusted you. Silas drew me a map in the dirt by firelight, showed me how he worked his circuit. 12 communities spread out across 3 counties, most of them not even big enough to call towns. Places like Lameta, Bend, Kepner, Copperas Cove, little settlements of maybe 10 or 20 families each. He'd spend 2 weeks in each place, 3 times a year, which meant he'd come back every 4 months or so. Not so often people got tired of him. Not so rare they forgot who he was. He taught me how to read people, how to know when to speak and when to just listen, how to make yourself useful fixing a fence or helping with harvest so folks would tolerate your preaching. He taught me that most people on the frontier weren't opposed to God. They were just tired and busy and didn't have energy left over for someone else's idea of righteousness. I rode with Silas for almost 6 months, learning his circuit, meeting the families he'd been serving for years. He introduced me as his apprentice, which made people more willing to accept me. By spring of 1873, when his rheumatism got so bad he couldn't sit a horse anymore, he gave me his map, his list of families, and his blessing. Told me the circuit was mine now if I wanted it. I was 25 years old and terrified, but I took it. The first family that really accepted me was the Pritchetts, out near Lometa. Nora Pritchett was a widow, maybe 40 years old, living in a 2-room cabin with her son, who was simple-minded, couldn't speak right, but could work a field better than any man I ever knew. Her husband had died of snakebite 3 years before I met her, and she was barely holding on, growing just enough corn and beans to keep them fed through winter. Every time I came through, and I mean every single time for almost 20 years, she'd insist on feeding me. Didn't matter that I could see her pantry was nearly empty. Didn't matter that I told her I had provisions in my saddlebag. She'd make cornbread and beans and set a plate in front of me, like I was doing her a favor by eating her food. I used to leave money under my plate when she wasn't looking, just $1 or $2, knowing she'd be too proud to take it if I offered directly. Years later, after she'd passed and her son had gone to live with relatives, I found out she'd been doing the same for every circuit rider who came through for decades. She fed preachers even when she was hungry herself, because that's what her faith told her to. Then there was Luther Vance. I met him in 1877 in a settlement called Adamsville that doesn't even exist anymore. He'd been a gun for hire during the wild days after the war, done things he wouldn't talk about except to say he had blood on his hands that wouldn't wash off. He was maybe 35, living alone in a dugout, keeping to himself, and people were scared of him. I didn't know any of this when I knocked on his door to introduce myself. He answered holding a rifle, didn't point it at me, but made sure I saw it, and I asked if I could water my horse at his well. He said yes, didn't invite me inside, just watched while I worked the pump. I thanked him and started to leave, then turned back and asked if he'd like me to pray for him. He stared at me for a long time, and I couldn't read his face at all, couldn't tell if he was about to shoot me or laugh at me. Then he said, "I reckon I need it more than most," and that was that. I came back every 4 months, and each time he'd let me talk a little longer. In 1877, during a sermon I gave in someone's barn about forgiveness and carrying weight you weren't meant to carry, I saw him in the back. Halfway through, he started crying, just silent tears running down into his beard, and when I finished, he walked out without saying a word. Next time I came through, his dugout was abandoned. Someone told me he'd gone west, maybe California, trying to start over. I never knew if what I said helped him or hurt him worse, but I think about him still. The hardest memory is the Rafferty twins, Caleb and Jonas, who died of diphtheria in the winter of 1881. They were maybe 6 years old, identical boys with red hair and freckles, full of energy and mischief. Their parents, Irish immigrants trying to make it as sharecroppers, sent word asking me to come quick because the boys were sick. I rode through a norther, temperature dropping so fast the sweat on my horse froze. Got there late at night and found both boys struggling to breathe, that terrible rasping sound diphtheria makes when it closes up the throat. Caleb died before dawn. I baptized Jonas with water from a bucket by lamplight, his mother holding him and praying in Gaelic, and he died maybe an hour later with his parents and me singing Amazing Grace, because we didn't know what else to do. We buried them together in ground, so frozen we had to build fires to soften the earth enough to dig. Their father shook my hand and thanked me for coming, and I wanted to tell him I hadn't done anything, hadn't saved anyone, hadn't even been able to ease their suffering. But he needed to believe my being there mattered, so I let him believe it. The spring of 1884 nearly killed me. I was riding between Bend and Lampasas, taking a shortcut through open country because I was running late to meet a family for a wedding, when the sky turned that peculiar green color that means serious trouble. The hail started small, like gravel pinging off my hat. Then within minutes, it was coming down in chunks the size of hen's eggs, some even bigger. Ezra panicked, reared up and threw me, and I hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, and the hail was pounding me, hitting my back and shoulders and head, and all I could think was, this is how I die, beaten to death by ice falling from the sky in the middle of nowhere. I managed to crawl under Ezra, who'd laid down on his side, and I pressed myself against his belly while the storm raged. It lasted maybe 20 minutes, but felt like hours. When it finally stopped, I was bruised everywhere, had a gash on my scalp bleeding into my eyes, and Ezra had welts all over his body, but was somehow still alive. We limped into Lampasas 2 days later, and I spent a week recovering in a boarding house, realizing how close I'd come to just disappearing, to nobody ever knowing what happened to the circuit rider who didn't show up. But the worst trouble came in 1885 in San Saba. There'd been a string of horse thefts, and tensions were running high, people forming vigilance committees and looking for someone to blame. I rode into town leading a bay mare I'd been asked to deliver to a family in the next county, a favor for a farmer who was too sick to travel. Somehow word got around that I'd stolen the horse, and before I could explain, a group of men surrounded me in front of the general store. Their leader was a man named Hackett, owned a big ranch north of town, and he was convinced I was part of a gang of thieves operating in the area. I tried to show them the letter I had from the horse's owner, tried to give them his name and location so they could verify my story, but they weren't interested in listening. Hackett said they ought to hang me right there as a warning to other thieves. I remember looking at the tree they were talking about using, a big live oak with a thick branch, and thinking about how stupid and random it would be to die for something I didn't do, to end up as just another body swinging from a tree in a town I barely knew. What saved me was a woman named Mrs. Henderson, schoolteacher in San Saba, who I'd met once before when I'd come through to preach. She pushed through the crowd and told Hackett that I was a Methodist circuit rider, that she'd heard me preach and knew people who could vouch for me. She stood there in the street, hands on her hips, and shamed those men for being ready to lynch someone without even checking their facts. They let me go, grudgingly, and I left San Saba that same day. Didn't stop riding until I was 20 miles away. I never went back to that town. Couldn't bring myself to do it. After that, I started thinking about giving up the circuit. I was 37 years old, tired, scared, beginning to wonder if I was doing any good at all, or just wandering in circles, waiting for something bad to happen. That's when I met Margaret Howell. She was teaching school in Goldthwaite, 32 years old, never married, sharp-minded and educated, from a good family in Kentucky who'd come west for reasons she didn't talk about at first. I was staying in a boarding house where she also lived, and we started talking at supper one evening, and I found myself telling her things I hadn't told anyone. We married in 1887, small ceremony in Goldthwaite with maybe 15 people present, and she changed everything about how I saw my work. Margaret would ride the circuit with me sometimes when school wasn't in session, and having her there made me see these families differently, made me notice things I'd been missing. She'd talk with the women while I talked with the men, and at night she'd tell me about their struggles, about childbirths gone wrong and loneliness, and the small desperations that people didn't share with the circuit preacher, but would share with another woman. We had a daughter in 1889, named her Sarah, and suddenly I understood in my bones what parents on the frontier were risking every day just by loving their children in a place where diphtheria and drought and accidents could take them in a heartbeat. I rode the circuit for 16 more years after marrying Margaret. The Texas I traveled through changed dramatically in that time. The railroad came through. Towns started growing up along the tracks. Churches got built with real steeples and bells, and the need for circuit riders began to fade. By 1903, when I was 55 years old, and my knees were bad from all those years in the saddle, I decided to make one last complete circuit, to visit all 12 communities one final time. What I found was bittersweet. Some places like Lampasas had grown into real towns with schools and hospitals and multiple churches. The circuit rider wasn't needed anymore because they had permanent preachers, buildings, organization. Other places had just disappeared, abandoned when the railroad bypassed them or when drought made farming impossible. I rode through where Adamsville used to be and found nothing but collapsed cabins and a cemetery nobody tended anymore. But in Lampasas, something unexpected happened. Word got out I was making a final round, and on Sunday morning, maybe 60 or 70 people showed up at the Methodist church, people I'd baptized or married or buried their loved ones over 30 years. Some of them were old now like me, grandparents with gray hair, and they wanted to thank me, to tell me I'd mattered in their lives. Luther Vance wasn't there, of course, and Nora Pritchett had been dead 10 years, and the Rafferty parents had moved away after losing their boys. But others remained, and they remembered, and I suppose that's all any of us can really hope for, that we mattered to someone, that our presence made a difference, even if it was small. I'm 80 years old now, recording this in 1928, and when I look back on those years riding from Lampasas to Burnett, to all those little communities in between, I don't see grand accomplishments or souls saved by the thousands. I see Nora Pritchett's cornbread still warm from the oven. I see Luther Vance's tears in the back of that barn. I see the Rafferty twins in the ground and their father's hand in mine. I see Margaret riding beside me, pointing out a hawk circling overhead. I planted seeds, some grew and some didn't, and I made my peace with not knowing which was which. That's what faith is. I think doing the work without needing to see all the results, trusting that showing up matters even when you can't measure how. The circuit is gone now. Those 12 towns either grew into something bigger or faded into nothing. But I rode them faithfully for 31 years, and that's my testimony. I was there. I bore witness. I tried to bring comfort. And if that was enough, then I lived a good life. If it wasn't, well, I did the best I could with what I had. That's all any of us can do.